If you can't set up a factory like he sets up a factory, don't talk that old equality talk. Who are you? You don't know. Don't tell me Negro, that's nothing. What were you before the white man named you a Negro? And where were you? And what did you have? What was yours? What language did you speak then? What was your name? It couldn't have been Smith or Jones or Bunch or Powell. That wasn't your name. They don't have those kind of names where you and I came from. No, what was your name? And why don't you now know what your name was then? Where did it go? Where did you lose it? Who took it? And how did he take it? What tongue did you speak? How did the man take your tongue? Where is your history?
He was born into this family of Garveyites. His father was an ardent member of Garvey's movement and was himself eventually murdered because of his fighting for the rights of black people in Nebraska. His mother, on the other hand, because of psychological issues, was institutionalized, and therefore the family was left without the father and the mother. Malcolm, in his early life, because of this, I believe, actually went into a life of petty crime. One of his teachers, his favorite white teacher in Nebraska, told him that as a Negro, you can't be an attorney, you can't do this, you can't do that, your aspirations are too high. He then moved from Nebraska to Detroit, to the Detroit area, got involved in petty crime, and then after that, of course, he was in prison. In prison, he came into contact with a number of people who were members of a group called the Nation of Islam. And it is there that he fell under the influences of the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. Now, I'm going to give you some background on this in a minute, but by 1952, he surrendered to what he considers to be the moral teachings of Islam. And he is now following Elijah Muhammad. He also gains a new name. He starts as Malcolm Little. He is convinced while in prison that, look, no black person stepped off the boat in America and was given the name Little. At least had the name Little. You didn't come from Africa with Little. That was not your name. You didn't come from Africa with Smith. That was not your name. This became a trope in Malcolm X's speeches later on. He would use this same line of argument. That no black man came here and got off the boat from Africa and said, I'm Washington. That was or I'm Lincoln or Jefferson or Johnson or Smith. These were not your names. You didn't have these names when you were in the African continent. So he gains a new name. And this new name that he gains is X. He was Malcolm X because his name was unknown. And his idea was, and the idea of the Nation of Islam at that time was, that no black person in the United States of America who walked around with an English name or a Dutch name or a German name was really on their own ground. That didn't make sense. It was absurd. It was just like seeing a Chinese person with a name like Benjamin Schwartz. But because we live in basically a crazy house in America, we don't see the craziness. And I'll tell you, let me tell you a real story. This is a true story. I've written about it in my memoirs. I went to Ghana the first time in 1972. You know my name is Molefi Asante, right? Molefi Kete Asante. But I went to Ghana, and when I went to Ghana, one of the things that happened to me in Ghana, when I asked the librarian for my book, the first book that I'd written, which is called The Rhetoric of Black Revolution, he brought the book to me, and he says, we have it, but we thought the person was an Englishman. Because my name at that time was Arthur Smith. You see? But I don't look like a Smith, do I? Right. So, but that was the issue. This is the issue with Malcolm. Malcolm is in prison. He gains a new name. And this new name that he gains for unknown, meaning unknown, which would be temporary in one sense, was something that was happening throughout the Nation of Islam. The man that we know now, for example, is Louis Farrakhan. When I met him, he was Abdul X. So the thing is that these names change because reality changes, transformation. People have different ideas about what things should happen and what should be. So he emerges quickly by his studiousness as a moral teacher, somebody who knows not only the principles and the concepts and the rituals and the values of the Nation of Islam, but he can be a teacher. And so soon, Elijah Muhammad, and I don't know where, you can really Google a lot of this. You can Google Elijah Muhammad. He was a very slight man, but a very intense man, who had probably got no more than an 8th grade education, grew up in the same state that I grew up in, Georgia, was persecuted very badly in Georgia. Georgia, of course, in those days was not a very agreeable state for black people, particularly if you were assertive. And so he left Georgia and went to Detroit. And Elijah Muhammad, and as I will explain in a few minutes, basically inherits an organization. But because he is studious and he is a detail-oriented person, he becomes a leader of an organization. He builds an organization not from the ground up, but basically a small organization. He builds it, and then he chooses Malcolm as his national spokesperson. He says, Malcolm, you can be. You are so good. You're so knowledgeable. You're so curious. I want you to be the national spokesperson for the Nation of Islam. He becomes the chief minister, and he was a tireless leader. He established mosques almost everywhere. And right here in Philadelphia, mosque number 12 and other mosques around the city, Malcolm was here all the time. He basically lived in West Philadelphia for a time, in the Powelton area, working very hard in that area to create the institutions. And we just, last year, we were able to get the state of Pennsylvania to create a historical marker, for Malcolm's presence here. Because he was very present in this area. Not only was he present in this area, he was present down the street at Cecil B. Moore, at the UNIA building. You see that little building down there, 2 blocks or 3 blocks off of Broad Street, UNIA? Malcolm was there. So he was very present in Philadelphia, but not only in Philadelphia. You know, he eventually became the chief minister in Harlem, in the New York Mosque, all right? So now, I told you in 1952, he joins the Nation of Islam. But the 1950s in America, these were turbulent times. These were not peaceful times. There had been many demonstrations already. People were testing the laws in the South on segregation, racial discrimination. 1954, we get the Supreme Court decision in the case between Topeka, Kansas, and Brown. Then we get the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. This is, of course, something that everybody knows, and if you've seen Selma, people really sort of connect this situation with Selma. One of the people who appears there, Fred Gray. How many people know the name Fred Gray? Wow, that's good. This demonstrates what I'm going to say, because people drop out of history. You know, history is a very selective process. But in the case of Fred Gray was the attorney for Martin Luther King Jr. And he was also the attorney for the Montgomery bus boycott. He later became a legislator in Alabama. He is still alive, and he appears, actually, there is a small part of the Selma movie where you see Fred Gray. But Fred Gray was perhaps on a local level. He was never, I don't think, considered a national figure. But on the local level in Montgomery, he was the legal force for the civil rights movement. The Montgomery bus boycott for Martin Luther King Jr., and he was, of course, just a year older than Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was like 26, he was 27, something like that, when they started this movement. He had just finished law school at Case Western in Ohio, and then had gone to Montgomery a year before King went to Montgomery, and then was chosen by the local people, actually, chosen by them to be the spokesperson for the Montgomery movement. Okay, all of this is happening in 55, 54, 55. By now, Malcolm is very, very much involved in the nation. There were people, I call them resilient resistors, too numerous to count, and their names are often dropped from history. One of the people is, of course, as I said, Fred Gray. But Malcolm rose from the masses. And I say this because perhaps one of the most difficult things in life for any human being is this, is out of the anonymity of the masses to stake out an identity. You know what young people call, what y'all call today, a brand. You know what I mean? It's really hard, right? How do you stake out a brand that rises above the anonymous masses? And out of this is what Malcolm does. He stakes a brand that rises above the masses, and he creates a persona that was different, that was dramatic, and that really captivated most of us. And I was one of the people captivated. I have to say this. I went to UCLA, and when I was at UCLA as head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee chapter on UCLA's campus, one of the things that really captured me was the life of Malcolm. We used to call ourselves the sons of Malcolm, because we felt that Malcolm had changed the identity of African people. So this was a big movement, 50s, and then the late 50s, 60s, early 60s, and middle 60s. So here's the deal, that what happened because of Martin Luther King Jr., there was a new reality produced in this country. Martin Luther King Jr., as brilliant as he was, came out of a middle-class Christian background. And also, he was a Southerner and came out of a Southern background. Malcolm comes out of the North. He comes out of an urban background, and he is transforming himself. He's being transformed. So I call him a transformatist in that sense, right? So he's being transformed. So what happens is that the ideologies of these two individuals clash. And they don't clash in a sense that one eliminates the other. They are, in effect, ideas that merge with a general movement of freedom in the black community. And there are, just as there are in any community, and there are always different strands of thought, different factions, different ways of thinking. Their goals were similar. That's better. Their goals were similar, not the same, but they were similar, right? Take it this way, and only to say that the Black Power movement and the Civil Rights movement, they both could be called the Black Freedom Struggle, or the Black Freedom Movement. And in that way, there is a convergence of these movements, but they do come from two different impulses. And those two different impulses were, I think, demonstrated in the life of Malcolm and in the life of Martin Luther King Jr. Malcolm's idea was systematic nationalism, and because he felt that this was the legitimate view of the African American people, and I'll explain that in a minute. These are the sources of his ideas. How many people heard of Martin Delaney? Good. Paul Robeson? Okay. You're all either history majors or African American studies majors, right? Right? Okay. Right. Marcus Garvey? Okay. You gotta get somewhere you don't know. Noble Drew Ali? All right, we're getting there. W.D. Fard? Okay, all right, okay. Okay. Those are the hardliners who know all these, right? Okay, now here is the thing. Here's the thing. The source of Malcolm's ideas. Elijah Muhammad, we know. Elijah Muhammad was the current leader of the Nation of Islam. He was, of course, the principal leader of the Nation of Islam. And Malcolm was his chief national spokesperson. But the history of this notion of systematic nationalism, which would involve self-definition, self-determination, agency, independence, black people speaking out of their own voices, all of this had a history. There were roots to this, you see? And in the 1850s, the person that is normally called the first black nationalist, and it's a term I don't use, because he never called himself a black nationalist, number one. But he was a transformative person. Was Martin Delaney, who was from Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh, right? Lived in Pittsburgh, most of his life, physician, black physician. And in 1850, after the fugitive slave law went into effect, they invited him to give a speech in Pittsburgh. He said to the mayor, "Honorable Mayor, whatever ideas of liberty that we have gained, that we understand, basically as black people, we have gained actually from following and listening and reading the words of liberty from your own fathers, your people. And what you basically say is that your home is your castle. And Honorable Mayor, my home is my castle. And in it dwells only my wife and my children, as free as the angels in heaven. And if any man should come to my house looking for a slave, be he the sheriff, be he a magistrate, be he the Supreme Court judge, or no, let it be Millard Fillmore himself, the president, with his cabinet as his bodyguard, with the Constitution of the United States as his shield, and the Declaration of Independence as his banner. Let him come to my house. And if he crosses the threshold of my door, and I do not lay him a lifeless corpse at my feet, may heaven refuse me entry, and may the grave refuse my soul a resting place. Something like that. I'm trying to. When he finished his speech, this is what inspired Malcolm. When he finished his speech, people said, "What kind of? This is an arrogant black man. He will even shoot the president." They were very furious at him. First black man, Paul Robeson. There are other people. I'm just going. These are people that you know if you read the stories about them. You see, Alexander Cromwell. I'm not going to talk about, but or Ed Blyden, but look at this. Paul Robeson. If you go back, read about Paul Robeson. In the 1950s, he was the most popular entertainer in America. He was internationally known. He was not only the most popular entertainer in America, he was the richest entertainer in America. And then he ran afoul of the American government. And the McCarthy era came. And McCarthy was a senator in this country who was looking for communists. And they basically persecuted Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson is from this area. In his last years, he lived down here near Rittenhouse Square. But he was persecuted. Why was he persecuted? Because he spoke his mind. Basically, that African people should be free, that they should be free to speak on any issue, to do anything that they wanted to do. Independence, agency, assertion. This was his attitude. It was a profound thing. Okay, if you read the speeches of Malcolm X, as I have done, you will see that they are the same speeches almost as Paul Robeson's speeches. They're some of the same tropes, figures, metaphors, same idea. And so there's an influence there. And there should have been an influence there. Paul Robeson was the biggest black person of his era. This was, everybody knew Paul Robeson. He was the man. So what Paul Robeson was saying influenced younger people like Malcolm. But so did Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey, of course, was, by all estimations, the most significant leader of African masses in history. Millions of people, at least 4 million. This is estimated. Some people say 10 million people paid $1 to become a member of his organization, the UNIAACL, Universal Negro Improvement Association, African Communities League. This was the organization that Malcolm X's father was a leader for. Marcus Garvey's organization. Garvey's organization had always argued Africa for the Africans at home and abroad. And this was against colonialism. There was, they had these settler colonies in Africa, in Kenya, Uganda, South Africa. And then you had the ones that were indirect rule countries. We had colonialism. Garvey was against it. And so he spoke out against it. And because he spoke out against it, I think, again, this is an influence on Malcolm. I see Malcolm in some of the speeches of Garvey. And if you listen to speeches of Garvey, you can tell this is a tradition. It's the same tradition, you see. Noble Drew Ali. Noble Drew Ali established something called the Moorish Science Temple. Moorish science was an ideology that came into being in early 20th century. And what Noble Drew Ali said was basically that black people were really Moroccans. All the black people in the United States of America are really Moroccans. Do we have any bays in here, for example? There's a bay. There's a bay. That comes from the Moorish science tradition. And that tradition was a tradition that said, look, black people who came to America, yes, there were people who were enslaved, but there were black people who were here before slavery. So who were those black people? So Noble Drew Ali said, these were independent, sovereign black people. So most of the people who are Moorish science, they have the name Bey or Al at the end of their names, you see, L or Bey. So they're Moorish science. Now, but here's the thing. When Noble Drew Ali was killed, then another man emerges to say he's the leader. And his name was W.D. Fard. Fard was probably born in North Carolina. We don't really know, right? But Fard claimed to be some mysterious being, mystic. He just appears, you see. And so what happened is a struggle ensues. He then forms the Nation of Islam. Nation of Islam is not formed by Elijah Muhammad. The Nation of Islam is formed by W.D. Ford. Ford, who called himself Wallace at some time. You remember the son of Elijah, one of them who was my friend, who passed away a few years ago, was Wallace Muhammad. Wallace Muhammad was a friend of mine, but Wallace was named for W.D. Ford. See? So his father named him for the man that he inherited the Nation of Islam for. So the Nation of Islam then gave us Elijah Muhammad. Elijah took that. I'm just running through this quickly. These are influences, sources of ideas for Malcolm. Now here are the main ideas. Black people have to be self-defining. You cannot allow white people to define you. Black people have to be self-determining. You cannot allow other people to determine what your reality should be. Because what these two elements, these principles we're dealing with, is what Malcolm deals with. The inheritances of the slave plantation. Because in the slave plantation, what happens is that you're not in charge of yourself. You're not in charge of your life. You're not in charge of your time. You're not even in charge of your thoughts. There's nothing that the black person can be in charge of if you're on the slave plantation. The slave plantation is essentially a space where you are not just a captive, you're a total victim. You know, Henry Louis Gates says 30% of all black people have white patriarchs. You know what that means? That means that 30% of black people have somewhere in their background white fathers. Slavery. You don't have freedom of your body. There's nothing, there's no freedom at all. And this is precisely why Malcolm says we have to be self-determining. It was our own assertion. Because if you don't assert, then other people will assert on you. So he understood that. And so that's why it was important to have authentic consciousness. Now what did he say? He said, consciousness came from history. You have to know your history. If you don't know your history, you will not even know anything about your own life. He said it's like it's like a chicken standing on a bag of rice and then claiming to be hungry. Because it's just not even looking around. You don't know. You see what I mean? It was an old African proverb. So what did he contribute? He created in 1964 Muslim mosques. Now, incorporated. Now, why did he do this? He created it. You remember he had a big fight with Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad, his spiritual father, his social father, and then he decides that, wow, Elijah Muhammad is doing a whole lot of things for young girls. And I don't like that. I've been a moral teacher. I've been an ethical person. I've been fighting for ethics, and lo and behold, the guy who is my spiritual father is doing all these things that I really don't understand. So he broke with Elijah Muhammad. And then not only did he break with him, he did a couple of things that Elijah didn't really like. One was he spoke publicly about it. And the second thing he did was to basically make a statement about the death of President Kennedy. He said the chicken have come home to roost. Basically, the president got what he deserved to get. Something like that. And Elijah Muhammad was very angry. So he basically said to Malcolm, you're suspended. Malcolm did it for a while, and then said, okay, I'll start my own mosque. But what he discovered about the African-American population was that the African-American population is overwhelmingly Christian. So if the African-American population is overwhelmingly Christian, there was only so far he would get with Islam. And he discovered this by being with the Nation of Islam. Everywhere he'd go, he'd run into these Christians. And when he started the mosque, then he said, wait a minute, I start the mosque and I'll keep it over here, but I have to start the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And the Organization of Afro-American Unity became his secular organization. And it is the one that he's most known for. Because the Organization of Afro-American Unity had many adherents, people who were not Muslims. Muriel Fieldings used to be here at this university. She was a member, one of the leaders of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. There are a number of people who are still alive who were working with Malcolm during the setup of the Afro-American Organization of Unity. Then also the creation of Kawaida. This is what I call from the sons of Malcolm and the children of Malcolm. The people who believed in Malcolm, who said, okay, here's what he's talking about. And Karenga, for example, said that what Malcolm was talking about was culture. That the fundamental crisis in the African-American population was a cultural crisis. That's the main crisis. The culture is not straight. We messed up with our culture. Excuse the vernacular, but I'm just trying to explain this. Because what he was trying to say was, look here. If in the African-American population we had a culture that was in sync with our historical realities, then things will be different. But because they are not, then we have to create institutions. This is why then Karenga says, okay, well, with Kawaida, let's create institutions. Let's create Kwanzaa. We have to have a holiday. Other people have holidays if they're mature. And all of this was based on the fact that for 246 years, Africans had been in slavery in this country. And to be enslaved for 246 years, remember this now. Think of this. I know it's hard to think like this. But we have been free in this country 100 years less than we were enslaved. The decades of indoctrination that basically moved us off of culture. So that's why you got black people walking around and saying, my name is John. Because they don't know the name. I mean, this is what Malcolm said. I'm just saying it's one of his names. But the black person doesn't know. You ask him, what's your name? My name is John. He said, wait a minute. Why your name is John? Where do you get that name from? Who gave you that name? This is Malcolm. Who gave you that name? What part of Africa did that name? This is the way he talked. What part of Africa did it come from? Did your great-great-great-grandfather give you that name? No. Well, then who did you get it from? A white man. That's what I'm telling you. It's a problem. That's Malcolm's rhetoric. It was severe. And it was critical, you see. So then the rise of Afrocentricity. Now Afrocentricity is very interesting because it's related to Kawaida as well. Because it assumes that one of the fundamental issues is a cultural crisis. But it also assumes something else. That if African people can have an understanding of agency and can act out of agency, then they will also be self-defining and self-determining. That if you could find your centered place in a particular phenomenon, then you can ask the proper question. But black people cannot ask the proper question so long as we assume that we're on the periphery of Europe. Because as long as we are on the periphery, on the margins of European experiences, We will never ourselves be able to be subjects. We will only be objects in the European worldview. That's what Malcolm understood that. So that's why Malcolm said, wake up. You gain consciousness. Gain a sense of consciousness so that you can understand that in order to interpret and understand the African reality, you must study. And you must ask the question, well, what is the African's role in this? Take the movie Selma. How many people seen it yet? Please see it. It's a good movie. I think there's some interesting parts to it. When Ava DuVernay was asked by someone, why didn't you give better roles to white people in this film? Why did you make President Johnson so indecisive? She said, this film is not about white people. This is a film about black agency. And she's right. That's the way the film is made. Black people doing. Were there white allies? Yes. But the point of entry for the white person was not the point of entry to save black people. You know, how many of you have been watching, what's the name of that movie on TV now? Book of the Negroes. Book of Negroes. Now, I know a lot about the Book of the Negroes because I have many friends in Nova Scotia, and I go to Halifax a lot. But when I was watching the book, I watched the whole thing, Book of Negroes. But everywhere in the Book of Negroes is white entry to save black people. That's not reality. This is not the truth. You don't. Were there some good white people? Yes. But do white people in general go out to help black people? No.
Talk, sir.
I don't see that. There's no history of that. Very few John Browns.
That's right.
And what did they call a person like John Brown? Crazy. Mm-hmm. Why? Because he helped black folks. That's right. That's the truth. Right? So Malcolm understood all of that. That's what I'm telling you. He understood that. And then even when you get the emergence of the Black Panthers, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, what do they say? But they say, we're the sons of Malcolm. Mm-hmm. Bobby Seale used to work here at Temple. He was in our department. He was the liaison. When I was chair of the department years ago, we hired Bobby Seale as the liaison between the university and the community. And you know what Bobby Seale says? Most people don't realize, but I was a black nationalist. I followed Malcolm. Then also black studies, African American studies, comes out of Malcolm's ideas. No one, black studies does not come from Martin Luther King Jr. It's not the impulse of Martin Luther King Jr. to start black studies. It would be the impulse of Martin Luther King Jr. to start maybe religious studies or some form of integrated studies, but not black studies. That's Malcolm X. Why did he say that? Because in his lectures and his talks, he said, every other study in the university is white studies. Psychology is white studies. They study white people. They study white theories. Sociologists, they study white sociological theories. They don't study black theories. What do they do in literature? They study British literature. They study French literature, Russian literature. They don't study Nigerian or Kenyan or Malian literature or Caribbean. See? So that's what Malcolm, what he brought chaos. He brought confusion. People didn't understand. Where is he going? You remember, this is much like Aimé Césaire. When Aimé Césaire wrote in the French language, the French surrealists and others said, he's a surrealist. But he wasn't a surrealist. When he says, my worst day is a white day. They said, he's surreal. He said, no, I'm not surreal. He said, I'm telling the truth. This is my truth, you see. So it's a very interesting twist of things. And so Malcolm comes to us with this. And so the Black Panthers, they owe their life to this. Kwame Ture, who was a friend of mine, and a very, really remarkable human, who also we have to protect, that he does not drop out of history. But Kwame Ture became a part of the Black Panthers mainly because he had been influenced by King. Then when he heard the rhetoric of Malcolm, he became influenced by the Black Panthers. And they made him one of the ministers in their organization. And so when you talk about black studies, African American studies, Malcolm says we ought to know our own history. And this is what I call the resurgence of historical studies. You need to go back and study ancient Egypt. You need to study ancient Nubia. You need to study Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, Ethiopia. You need to study Monomotapa. You need to study Mapum Gubwe. You need to study the African civilizations before you know it, because otherwise you don't know anything. You're moving out in the world, but you don't have your own stuff with you. That is what Malcolm taught. And that's why black studies and African American studies, move in that direction. And let me just say this, and this is not by way of criticism, but it's just for you to understand. Black studies did not come from a Marxist impetus. People didn't start black studies department because they were Marxists. That didn't happen. Nowhere in the United States. I was in the movement. I was the first director of black studies at UCLA. We didn't start from Marxism. We started from black nationalism. The freedom movement, independence, a sense of agency and assertion. Because Malcolm taught us that that's what you have to do. You have to be yourself. You cannot be just an object in somebody else's world. I'm saying that because people get confused. And you can't get confused. You should know what this is. All right, fundamentally, his initializing impulse was resistance to tyranny. That's what his nature was. He problematized the Africans' responses to Christianity. He challenged the concept of nonviolence. He asserted the idea of pride in race and culture. And then he lived a life of morality of sacrifice. I mean, his martyrdom was ultimately part of the morality of sacrifice. That's the way he lived. He lived his life for the collectivity, for the collective, for the people. That's what he would say, for the people, for the masses. He didn't live his life for the middle class or for the rich. He lived his life for the people. That's how Kwame Ture lived his life. For the people. So that's a different sentiment. They were not public intellectuals. Malcolm wasn't a public intellectual. He was an activist. He was committed to actual change and transforming society. Not just debating about it. This is what he wrote for Mecca. Never have I witnessed such sincere hospitality, an overwhelming spirit of true brotherhood as is practiced by people of all colors and races here in the ancient Holy Land, the home of Abraham, Muhammad, and the other prophets of the Holy Scriptures. For the past week, I have been utterly speechless and spellbound by the graciousness I see displayed all around me by people of all colors. That remark is probably quoted more than any other remark by Malcolm, all right, internationally. Let me read you another part of the same letter. Never have I been so highly honored. He changed his name, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, meaning that he had made the Hajj to Mecca. Never have I been so highly honored. Never have I been made to feel more humble and unworthy. Who would believe the blessings that have been heaped upon an American Negro? A few nights ago, a man who would be called in America a white man, a United Nations diplomat, an ambassador, a companion of kings, gave me his hotel suite, his bed, never would I have even thought of dreaming that I would ever be a recipient of such honors, honors that in America would be bestowed upon a king, not a Negro. All praise is due to Allah, the Lord of all the worlds. That's what he wrote in his letter, 1964. But you know what? I think that people then have really misunderstood this letter in many ways. Let me show you let me just read this. This is my viewpoint. Malcolm was against hegemonic white supremacy anywhere in the world. The fact that he went to Mecca and saw this incredible conglomeration of people of all colors did not change all of his life up until that time. And that's why he said, and this is on YouTube, in a video, they interviewed him. Well, Malcolm, tell us about Mecca. When Mecca changed you? He said, when I said what I said in Mecca, I was talking about the people over there. Not the people here. This is what he said. You can see that. He said, no, this is different from America. I'm talking about the people there, not the people here. And I think Karenga is right when he argues. He has a new book coming out called Ethics of Malcolm. He said, we cannot introduce the centrality of whiteness as a pivot for Malcolm's life. You can't just say, okay, well, because he talks about, well, he now sees white people and black people all that this is the main. That's not the main. That's not. You can't say that as a main turning point in his life. That was one moment, and this is what I wrote in my book in 1993, which my book is called Malcolm X's Cultural Heroes and Other Afrocentric Essays. Malcolm saw that the adaptation of our ideas, attitudes, language, and history to the social and cultural imperatives of the African people was the first requirement for a comprehensive transformation. There could be no other interface with our historical destiny. We had to center ourselves in our African reality. If we didn't, we were lost forever. We would always be on the margins of Europe. We would not be ourselves. We would not even speak our own names correctly. You see? So this was my view. So, and the end goes, a new person, he goes to West Africa the same time he goes to Mecca. And in West Africa, what does he do? He is called by the Yoruba people, he's given another name. In Mecca, he becomes El Hajj, Malik El-Shabazz. In Nigeria, he becomes Omawale, the son who has returned home. They give him a whole new name. So now, this is why I call it the topography of transformation. All these transformations are happening. But what was his end goal? He wanted to destroy the shuffling Negro. You know the images you see on TV sometimes, the old movies of the shuffling Negro with the big eyes? He wanted to destroy that. That was his whole desire. And that's what captured me. You know, we used to say, I'm telling you this, I can tell y'all this. We used to say, we're scared for Malcolm. You see how he talked to those white people? He's scared. Malcolm get up and he said, you know, Negroes shouldn't do this, and Negro, if you hit me, I'll hit you back. You know, we said, Malcolm, you can't be talking like that to white people. we were a little scared from Malcolm. I'm telling you, we were a little nervous about Malcolm. And then there were some of us who said, well, you know, Malcolm is speaking tonight, but, well, I ain't going. You know, I'm going to stay on the side here. Yeah, I wait till Martin Luther King comes. We have a whole different dream. But he wanted to overthrow white racial domination. He wanted to reassert systematic nationalism. And he had a trajectory of victorious consciousness. And that is what I'm going to end with.